Lead. Crystal glass felt all wrong in Eliza Thorne's hand. It was supposed to hold something sweet and pink, like ratafia, but tonight it held a single finger of honey-colored scotch. Legal. Burn of the liquor was a quiet secret against her palm. A small rebellion in the middle of the grandest drawing room she'd ever seen. Tau. Outside, beyond the towering windows, a December blizzard howled like a living thing, trying to get in. It was December 27th, 1819. The place was Blackwood Manor, a hulking stone castle in the Scottish Highlands, and Eliza was a guest of charity. Her grotante, the Dowager Countess of Blackwood, had invited her for the annual Christmas house party. Eliza, a widow of 3 years with a modest annuity of £80 a year, knew exactly what she was. The poor relation, given a taste of glittering society out of pity. She was 28, and her grey silk gown, though neat, was 2 seasons out of fashion. The room was a symphony of noise and light. A dozen, of London's finest store at least, Richard laughed and played at charades near the roaring fireplace. The scent of beeswax candles, pine boughs, and expensive perfume filled the air. Lady Fitzwilliam, a woman with feathers in her hair, was miming what appeared to be a distressed duck. Too much giggling. Elisa smiled, the polite, practiced curve of her lips that meant nothing at all. She was excellent at being invisible, at moving through rooms like a helpful ghost. Her eyes, without her meaning them to, found the room's true center of gravity. Lord Alistair Blackwood, the Dowager's son and heir, stood by the mantelpiece, who was tall, with dark hair and a face that seemed carved from the same Highland stone as his house. He wasn't joining the game. He wasn't even smiling. He simply watched, his gaze moving slowly over the crowd, like a man counting inventory. Flynn. His eyes briefly met Eliza's. There was no warmth in them. Jet's assessment made a shiver go down her spine, unrelated to the cold outside. It's a beast of a storm, is it not, Mrs. Thorne? Eliza turned to find the Dowager beside her, too. The older woman's smile was as polished as the silver tea service. It is. Indeed, Aunt. But the house feels very secure. Blackwood has stood for 300 years, the Dowager said, sipping her wine. A little snow is nothing to these walls, though it does make one appreciate good company. A well-managed household. Her eyes flickered over Eliza, noting the precise way she'd arranged her shawl. Defect. Her glass left no ring on the marquetry table. You have a talent for order, my dear, a rare commodity. It was an odd thing to say at a party. Before Eliza could reply, a burst of laughter erupted from the charades players. Sir Reginald, a baronet with very red cheeks, had collapsed onto a sofa in a fit of pretend despair. The ormolu clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly, marking the passing seconds. It was almost 11:30. The last normal moments stretched thin, like parchment held to a candle flame. The hairline fracture came a moment later. Eliza, moving to set her untouched scotch down, overheard a snippet of conversation from 2 young gentlemen near the curtain. Blackwood's practically a ruin, you know, one murmured, his voice barely carrying over the piano someone had started playing. I'll show in London. Heard from my man of business. Mortgaged to the eaves. Then why this lavish party? The other asked. Mother's doing. Last gasp of the old ways. Law. The man chuckled. Perhaps he's here to snag an heiress. The American girl, maybe, needs to refill the coffers. Eliza stepped away smoothly, her heart beating a little faster. Explained. Lord Blackwood's intense, joyless scrutiny wasn't bored. He was desperate. The glittering room suddenly looked different. The gilded frames seemed tarnished at the edges. The lavish spread of sugared fruits and spiced cakes felt like a performance. She saw the strain in the Dowager's smile. The calculated way Lord Blackwood now spoke to Miss Amelia Pratt, the railway heiress from New York. Eliza felt a pang of sympathy, quickly followed by wariness. She understood precarious finances better than anyone in this room, but she was just a spectator here. This wasn't her tragedy. The storm seemed to answer that thought. A gust of wind, stronger than any before, hit the manor like a giant's fist. The window panes rattled violently in their leads. Every candle flame in the room swayed, sending shadows leaping up the walls. The piano music stopped with a discordant jangle. Then came the sound. It wasn't the wind, Vib. It was a deep, groaning crack from deep within the house, followed by a roar of falling stone and a scream of tearing timber. It came from the east wing, through. The floor trembled under Eliza's feet. A second later, a blast of frozen air, smelling of ancient dust and shattered slate, ripped down the corridor and into the drawing room, blew out every single candle, plunging them into absolute howling darkness. Chaos erupted. A woman shrieked. Glass shattered as someone knocked over a table. Men shouted confused questions. Eliza stood perfectly still, the cold air biting her face. Sure. Heard the dowager's voice, tight with fear, calling for a footman. She heard Sir Reginald bellowing about bandits. And then, cutting through the panic, a calm, cold voice. Lord Alistair Blackwood. He must have moved, because his voice came from near the doorway now. A single lantern flared to life, held by his steady hand, illuminated his stark, unsmiling face, and the terrified guests around him. "Be silent," he said, and the room obeyed. Was not bandits, was the East Wing gallery roof. He paused, and in that pause, the only sound was the frantic moan of the wind through a new, gaping wound in his house. He looked directly at his mother, then let his gaze sweep over the gathered faces of the ton. Their fine clothes now shrouded in darkness. "The bridge is gone." 2 sentences, that was all. The stone bridge, the only way across the ravine that separated Blackwood Manor from the village and the main road, was gone. The hairline fracture, in their reality, had just become a canyon dot in the shaky lantern light. Eliza looked at the stopped ormolu clock. Its hands were frozen at exactly 11:30. Time, for them, had just taken a very different turn. She looked at the lead crystal glass still in her hand, the scotch now utterly forgotten. The glass of the normal world was gone, swept away by snow and stone, and as the guests began to babble again, their voices rising in fear and complaint, Eliza saw Lord Blackwood not looking at the ruined ceiling or his weeping mother, too. He was looking straight at her, his expression unreadable. In that moment, a single unspoken question hung in the icy air between them. What happens now? The morning after the roof fell in was a quiet, shocking thing. The grand drawing room of Blackwood Manor, which just hours before had been full of light and silly laughter, now felt like a damp, dark cave. Grey December light seeped through the windows, showing the world outside was still a swirling wall of white. The air smelled different, now less like perfume, more like cold stone, old dust, and the sharp, clean scent of snow that had blown in through the cracks. Eliza woke up stiff, wrapped in a borrowed blanket on a drawing room sofa. Around her, the other guests were stirring, a collection of rumpled silk and confused faces. Someone's stomach growled loudly in the quiet. That one sound seemed to change everything. The fear of the night before turned into a more practical, gnawing kind of worry. They weren't just trapped. They were 20 hungry people in a half-broken house. Lord Blackwood was already awake. Lisa saw him standing by a window, his back to the room, speaking in a low voice to Mr. Macaulay, the stern-faced Scottish butler. "Do accounting." Lord Blackwood held a ledger, his finger moving down a list. Macaulay would nod or shake his head. Eliza knew what that meant. They were counting the food. The Dowager Countess, trying to keep a sense of normalcy, declared that breakfast would be served in the small dining room. But when the group shuffled in, the sight was sobering, too. Instead of the usual silver-domed platters of eggs and kippers, there was a single pot of porridge, a loaf of brown bread, and a modest block of butter. The coal scuttle by the fireplace was only half full, the black lumps looking precious and few dot. The silence at the table was heavy, broken only by the clink of spoons. Sir Reginald, the red-faced baronet, was the first to crack. "Is this it?" he boomed, staring at his small bowl. "Porridge for a house party." Lord Blackwood didn't look up from his own bowl. "The storerooms in the East Wing are under 3 feet of snow and broken timber. Sir Reginald, the bridge is gone. This," he said, his voice flat, "is what is secure and accessible." Eliza ate her porridge, was plain but warm. She watched as Miss Amelia Pratt, the American heiress, poked at hers with a distasteful expression. She'd watched as young Lord Pembroke tried to take a second slice of bread, only to have Macaulay gently clear his throat. Rules were forming, invisible but firm, and not everyone liked them. In the days that followed, a strange new rhythm began. Storm raged for 3 more days, sealing them in completely. The great house, built for hundreds, now felt cramped and cold. Drafts whistled down corridors they had to close off. The only warm rooms were the kitchen, the main drawing room with its one fireplace kept burning low, and the library. People reacted in different ways. Some, like the Dowager, clung to routine, insisting on changing for dinner, even if dinner was now thin soup and potatoes. Others, like the charming but useless Vicene, to think it was all a grand adventure, and spent most of his time trying to flirt with the maids, Sue, who were too busy to notice. Eliza couldn't stand the idleness, too. On the second day, she found Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper, looking pale and overwhelmed in the kitchen, trying to plan meals with cook. 3 scullery maids were down with colds. The laundry was piling up. Mrs. Bell, Eliza said softly, rolling up the sleeves of her old, practical wool dress. Perhaps I could help with the inventory. I'll have a good head for figures. The housekeeper looked at her with grateful, tired eyes. An hour later, Eliza was in the main storeroom, a cavernous, chilly space, with a slate and chalk. She counted sacks of oats, jars of preserved apples, sides of salted bacon hanging from hooks. She noted everything. Her handwriting, neat and precise, was calming work. This, she understood. She didn't realize Lord Blackwood was watching from the doorway until she turned around. Her hands dusty with flour, stood there, silent as always, just observing. I hope you don't mind, my lord, she said, suddenly feeling she'd overstepped. Mrs. Bell, seemed I don't mind, he interrupted, too. His eyes weren't on her face, but on the slate in her hands. The totals, a day accurate. She handed him the slate, scanned the numbers, his brow furrowed. For a moment, he looked less like a lord and more like a worried farmer before a hard winter. We'll need to ration the bacon, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Stretch the oats. He handed the slate back. Thank you, Mrs. Thorne. It was the first time he'd used her name. He left as quietly as he came. That small moment of cooperation didn't escape notice. At dinner that night, a tension was brewing. The drawing room was cold because Lord Blackwood had ordered the fire kept low to save coal. The Honourable George Finchley, a young dandy who was always complaining about the chill, had had enough. This is absurd, he announced, his voice too loud in the quiet room. I'm paying, that is. I'm a guest here. I demand a proper fire in my bedroom tonight. My valet is shivering. The Dowager tried to soothe him. Mr. Finchley, we must all make sacrifices. Speak for yourself. Finchley sniffed. He turned to Macaulay butler. Have a footman bring a full scuttle of coal to the blue room at once. Macaulay stood very still, his eyes flicking to Lord Blackwood. Rewant waited. Elisa held her breath. This was the first real challenge to the new, fragile order. Lord Blackwood looked up from the book he was pretending to read. The coal is rationed. Finchley, team 1 scuttle per day for this room, no exceptions. Finchley's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, stomped out, muttering about insufferable Scots and poor hospitality. The room was left in an uncomfortable silence. But Eliza saw what happened next. She saw Macaulay give a slight nod to a young footman named Thomas. Later, when she went to fetch an extra shawl from the trunk in her chilly bedroom, she passed the attic staircase. She heard a soft rattling cough from above. One of the 6 scullery maids, and she saw Thomas, the footman, carefully carrying not a full scuttle, but a small bucket of precious coal, up the narrow attic stairs. He saw her seeing him, and froze, panic in his eyes. Eliza simply put a finger to her lips and gave him a small, understanding nod. She turned and walked away, her heart beating hard. She'd just made a choice. She'd seen an injustice warmth for a complaining dandy over a sick working girl, and she had silently sided with the staff. It was a small act of defiance, but in the close, watchful world of the manor, it felt huge. It was choosing people over protocol, A few days later, the weather broke, not into warmth, but into a clear, brittle, deadly cold. The sun shone on a world buried under 5 feet of snow. From the window, they could see the distant gorge where the bridge had been. Only 2 jagged stone pillars remained, like broken teeth, with a yawning emptiness between them. The sight extinguished the last flicker of hope for a quick rescue. They were truly isolated. The mood in the house sank lower. Decole's cuddle in the drawing room was now a daily reminder of their shrinking world. It was filled less each morning. You could see the black line of coal sinking lower, day by day. Like a grim hourglass, it was on one of these bleak, bright afternoons that Eliza went looking for more blankets. Someone had mentioned an old linen press in the West Wing library. The library was a long, high-ceilinged room, lined with books that smelled of leather and age. It was cold, but peaceful. She pushed open the heavy door and stopped. Lord Blackwood was there. He wasn't reading a book of poetry or philosophy. He was bent over the large oak desk, which was covered not in books, but in large, sprawling maps of the Blackwood estate. Ledgers were piled high, sleeves were rolled up, and his fingers were stained with dark ink. He looked tired, and younger somehow, stripped of his usual cold composure. He looked up, startled. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The silence stretched out, filled only by the tick of a clock she couldn't see. "Mrs. Thorne," he said finally, whose voice was rough. "I was looking for blankets," she said, feeling she needed to explain her intrusion. He gestured vaguely toward a far cabinet, but his attention was already back on the map. He was tracing a line with his finger a property boundary. She thought, He let out a slow, frustrated breath, a cloud in the cold air. Curiosity got the better of her. She took a step closer. The maps were incredibly detailed, showing fields, tenant cottages, woodlands, but scrawled across them in that same dark ink were numbers, calculations, and in the margins, words like yield and debt service. This wasn't a lord idly reviewing his lands day. This was a man fighting a battle on paper. The rumors she'd overheard were true. Then, the reality was here, in these desperate scribbles. "The East Field," she heard herself say quietly. The one on the south slope. If the drainage is poor, the winter wheat will have rotted. Be better to let it lie fallow and expand the potato plot in the lower meadow next season. Potatoes store better, and they feed more people per acre. He went perfectly still. Then, he slowly turned his head to look at her. His gaze was intense, searching. Read agricultural surveys for pleasure. Mrs. Thorne, Shemet. His eyes, her own cheeks warming. I read my late husband's, and I managed our small home farm for 2 years after he passed. Kept the roof over my head. She shrugged, a simple, practical gesture. It's just numbers and soil. It either works or it doesn't. He stared at her for another long moment, and then he did something unexpected. Didn't smile, but some of the harshness left his face. Who nodded? "Once, numbers, and soil," he repeated quietly. The silence in the library, after Lord Blackwood's confession, was the coldest thing Eliza had ever felt. It was deeper than the winter outside, colder than the snow. She looked down at the ledger, her fingers still resting on the page of red ink. The numbers seemed to blur. She wasn't a guest. She was a prospect, a possible employee, assessed over Christmas pudding and charades. She didn't say another word to him. She simply closed the heavy book with a soft thud, turned, and walked out of the library. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, each one sounding hollow. For the next week, she moved through the manor like the ghost she'd once pretended to be. She did her tasks, helping Mrs. Bell with the mending, reading to the dowager, but her mind was somewhere else. Trapped in that moment of realization, the heart of winter had them in its grip. It was mid-January now, 1820. The world outside was a frozen, silent painting. Inside, the chill was seeping into everything, into their bones and their tempers. The once cheerful drawing room was now a place of short words and long silences. The coal ration was smaller than ever. You could see your breath in the bedroom corridors. The isolation was total. Did strange things to people. Miss Amelia Pratt, the American heiress, took to wearing all her jewelry at once, the diamonds and sapphires flashing in the firelight, as if to prove she still had value. Sir Reginald argued constantly with his wife over nothing at all. Veneer of polite society was cracking, showing the raw, frightened people underneath. And then, the fever came. It started with young Miss Lydia, Viscount Pembroke's sister, a sweet, quiet girl of 17. She woke up one morning burning hot, her skin dry as paper, with a cough that rattled in her chest. De Manners, one elderly doctor, himself stranded with them, looked grave. She needed constant care, he said. A quiet room, cool cloths, someone to watch her through the night. The guests gathered in the drawing room, a nervous flock. The dowager wrung her hands. Score. The yellow room at the end of the east corridor is the most isolated, she said. 2. It will keep the rest of us safe. Who will nurse her? Lady Fitzwilliam asked, her voice sharp with fear. Not me. I have a very delicate constitution. A chorus of similar excuses followed. I couldn't possibly. Door. I wouldn't know how. I might catch it. The words hung in the air, selfish and desperate. It was George Finchley, the dandy who'd demanded the coal, who said the quiet part out loud. He pointed a lazy finger across the room, directly at Eliza. Well, she's the most practical one among us. And let's be honest, she's the least essential to the party. Mrs. Thorne should do it. The room went quiet. Every pair of eyes turned to Eliza. Not with pity, but with relief. They had found their solution. The helpful, invisible widow. PL. Of course she would do it. She was always doing things. Lord Blackwood was standing by the fireplace. Seekty opened his mouth as if to speak, but Eliza caught his eye. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. This was her moment, not his. She'd looked at the circle of fashionable, frightened faces. These people she had once been so eager to impress. Of course, Eliza said, her voice clear and calm in the hushed room. I will nurse her. They all exhaled. Through. The problem was solved, as she left to gather supplies. She heard the conversation quickly turn back to whether the card game that night would be whist or speculation. The door to the sick room, they seemed to think, had closed between them and the unpleasantness. The yellow room was indeed isolated, and it was freezing. A small grate held a meager fire that did little more than take the deadly edge off the air. The only furniture was the bed, a chair, and a small table. Liza brought in her own blankets and a pitcher of water that already had a thin skin of ice on top. For 3 days and 3 nights. She lived in that room. She learnt the rhythm of Lydia's fever, the terrible heat of her skin in the evening, the frightening chills that shook the bed at midnight. She spent hours wringing out cloths in a basin of icy water, placing them on the girl's forehead. Her own hands grew red and chapped. The candle by the bed burned down, and she replaced it, marking the passage of time by the pools of wax on the saucer. During the long, quiet hours, she had nothing to do but think, and she saw herself with a terrible, clear honesty. She was a martyr. She wasn't even just a kind person. She was the infrastructure. She was the person who did the necessary, difficult work so others could continue their games. She was the foundation stone in the wall, essential but unseen, walked upon every day, invisible, until they needed her to carry a new weight. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Lydia's skin grew cool and damp with sweat. She opened her eyes, clear and aware for the first time, and whispered, "Thank you, Mrs. Thorne." Eliza smoothed her hair back, a sudden, fierce wave of emotion tightening her throat. This, at least, had been real. She stepped out of the room into the dark corridor, desperate for a moment of quiet, for a breath of air that didn't smell of sickness. She found Lord Blackwood waiting there, leaning against the wall. He looked exhausted. There was soot smudged on his cheek and on his hands. "There was a fire," he said quietly, seeing her questioning look. In the east wing, a candle, left unattended. "We just put it out." Eliza felt a jolt of alarm. "Is everyone is fine." It was small, but it took hours to haul the snow and water to douse it. He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in her tired eyes, her simple dress. "You saved her life," he said, nodding toward the SICKROOM. Eliza just shrugged, the weight of her realization still heavy on her. Thor. It was the task that needed doing. He was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the distant drip of melting snow from the eaves. The thaw was beginning, ever so slightly. Then, he spoke, his voice low and raw. What is your price, Eliza? Not Mrs. Thorne. Eliza. The question hung between them. Speed. He was offering her a way out, paid position as his estate manager. Tours. It was a real job, with real authority and a real salary. It was also social suicide. A gentlewoman, working for a wage. The ton would never speak to her again. She would be an outcast, but she would be independent, powerful, in a way she had never been. Or she could refuse. The thaw was coming. The bridge would eventually be repaired. She could go back to London, back to her tiny, respectable apartment, her £80 a year, her invisible life on the edges of society, safe, but small, always waiting for an invitation, always the helpful ghost. It was an impossible choice, freedom with scorn, or safety with silence. Before she could even form an answer, a maid came rushing down the hall, her face pale. Mrs. Thorne, come quickly. To Miss Lydia. She's asking for you. She's upset. Eliza turned away from Lord Blackwood, from his question, and went back into the sick. Lydia was crying weakly, confused from the fever. Eliza sat by her side, holding her hand, murmuring soft words until she fell back asleep. The candle on the table guttered and finally went out, leaving them in the grey pre-dawn light. As she sat there in the silence, men watching the girl sleep peacefully, the final piece of understanding settled over her. The Dowager's charity, the invitation, the nice room at the party. It had all been a lie. A gentle, well-dressed lie, but a lie all the same. She was never meant to be a guest. She was always meant to be a tool, a solution. But kindness was just the wrapping paper. The realization didn't hurt as much as she thought it would. Too. In a way, it was freeing. When you saw the truth, you could finally stop pretending. You could finally decide what you wanted. She stood up, her joints stiff. She walked to the window and looked out at the frozen world. Thor. The first hint of dawn was painting the sky a pale, watery pink. Down below, she saw the well in the courtyard, a circle of stone capped with ice. Without putting on her cloak, she left the sick room, walked down the stairs, and pushed open the heavy front door. The cold hit her like a physical wall, stealing her breath. She walked across the crunching snow to the well. She picked up the iron bar used to break the ice, its metal searing her bare hands with cold. She raised it and brought it down, once, twice, 3 times, until the ice cracked and shattered, revealing the dark water below. She stood there, her breath coming in white clouds, her hands burning, feeling more awake and alive than she had in years. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a woman in the snow, and she had a choice to make. That, in itself, was a kind of fire. The first London ball of the season was a symphony of soft light and softer chatter. Hundreds of candles glittered in the crystal chandeliers of the Hollingsworth House ballroom, reflecting off the pastel silks and satins of the dancers. There, the air was warm, thick with the scent of beeswax, hothouse flowers, and expensive cologne. A string quartet played a sweet familiar tune in the corner. It was March 1820, and the world had spun back onto its well-oiled axis. Near a pillar of veined marble, Eliza Thorne stood, observing, but she was not holding a lead crystal glass of ratafia. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her, free and empty. She wore a gown of deep grey silk, the color of a winter sky just before dawn. It was cut with a severe, elegant simplicity that stood out starkly against the frothy confections around her. There were no flounces, no fussy ribbons. It was the dress of a woman who did not wish to be mistaken for decoration. She was listening, with genuine interest, to a round-faced man with spectacles discuss the potential impact of wool tariffs on northern mills. She asked a pointed question about spindle technology, and he blinked, then answered with newfound respect. A ripple moved through the crowd near her, a subtle shift in attention. Whispers, like little rustling leaves, followed in its wake. That's the one who was snowbound at Blackwood. Can you believe the dress? I heard she actually works with the tenants. They call it a frostbite union. Lisa heard them. She did not stiffen. She did not blush. Small.com smile touched her lips. The whispers were the price of entry, and she had decided, standing by that frozen well in Scotland, that the price was worth paying. For when the thaw had finally come in late February, and the first rough sled had made it across the ravines to Blackwood Manor, P.O., the rescue had not found a collection of weary, desperate guests. They had found a community. Thorne. They had found Eliza Thorne in the library, not with a novel, but with a state map spread before her, and a list of spring planting rotations written in her neat hand. Slawed. Blackwood was beside her, not hovering, but listening. There had been no dramatic proposal under the moonlight. There had been a conversation, as practical as the one about potato yields. He had offered her the position again, his terms clear, a partnership, a share of the profits, her authority absolute in matters of household and land management. And she had looked at him, at this man who had seen her competence and called it valuable. And she had said, I have a condition. Name it. He'd replied, we do it as equals. Tor, in the eyes of the law and the eyes of the ton. Or not at all. He had nodded, once, then, we shall have to be married. It was a statement, not a question. A business merger of the most personal kind. Nelisa, who had spent a lifetime being chosen last, or not at all, had found herself choosing this. Choosing the work, the land, the challenge, and perhaps choosing the man who saw her as a partner, not a prop. So she was now Eliza, Viscountess Blackwood. The scandal had been delicious, short-lived, and ultimately powerless against the results. The first shipments of Blackwood wool, of higher quality and better price than before, were already making waves. The talk had shifted from the how of their marriage to the how well the estate was doing. A presence settled beside her at the pillar. She didn't need to look to know it was Alistair. She could feel the solid quiet of him, a familiar anchor in the swirling sea of the ballroom. He, too, was dressed with a new simplicity. T's jacket was well cut, but without excessive embroidery. He looked like a man who had better things to do than stand around all night. He didn't speak for a moment, just followed her gaze. It landed on a young woman shivering by the terrace doors, trying to look invisible in a slightly faded pink gown. Miss Eleanor Ellis, Eliza recalled, an orphan with a small, troublesome inheritance. Clinging to the edges of society, Eliza moved. She caught the eye of a passing footman, a young man she recognized from Blackwood's London staff, who stopped immediately, attentive. James, she said, her voice low but clear, fetch a shawl for Miss Ellis. The good wool one from the blue sitting room, not the lace, the warm one. It was an order, given with a quiet expectation of obedience, not a request from one guest to another, but a direction from someone who was used to managing a household. The footman nodded, at once. My lady. Alistair watched the exchange, a faint, almost invisible smile at the corner of his mouth. As the footman hurried off, he leaned closer, his shoulder just brushing hers. His voice was a low rumble only for her. Another project. Elisa finally turned her head to look at him. Her grey eyes, which had once been so careful to show nothing, now held a glint of warm, quiet amusement. She did not answer his question. She didn't need to. She simply turned back, watching as the footman returned and placed the thick, soft wool shawl around Miss Ellis's shoulders. The girl looked up, startled, first at the footman, then across the room. Her eyes met Eliza's. There was no pity in Eliza's gaze, just a simple, acknowledging nod. The girl's shoulders, which had been hunched with cold intention, slowly relaxed. She pulled the shawl tight, a tiny, grateful smile on her face. Eliza looked away. The quartet began a new waltz. Couples swept onto the floor. The ballroom was a beautiful, buzzing machine, exactly as it had been before her winter birth. She was not the same woman who had entered Blackwood Manor clutching a glass of illegal Scotch. She felt Alistair's hand, warm and sure, find hers for just a moment, a brief, hidden contact amidst the crowd. Then, he offered his arm. The air in here is stifling, he said. I have had my fill of pretending to be decorative. She took his arm. Together, they turned their backs on the glittering ballroom, on the whispers and the watching eyes. They did not slip out like guilty secrets. They walked out with a purpose, their footsteps measured and sure on the polished floor. They left the chatter behind, not as exiles, but as people with more important things to attend to. There were estate reports to read, a new breed of sheep to discuss, a letter from a tenant farmer about a roof that needed mending. Outside, in the crisp March night, their carriage waited. As the footman handed her in, Eliza looked up. The sky was clear, dotted with sharp, bright stars. In the square, the first brave daffodils nodded their yellow heads in the thin light of the gas lamps. Defying the last of the winter chill, she settled into the seat across from Alistair. The carriage moved off, the sounds of the ball fading into the distant rumble of London. They rode in a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between two people who no longer need to fill the space with words. The winter at Blackwood had left its mark, not as a scar of damage, but as a seam, too. It was the place where her old life and her new one had been forged together, under pressure and cold and necessity, and had emerged stronger. She was no longer a ghost, no longer just infrastructure, she was the architect. As the carriage carried them home, through the streets of a city already forgetting its latest scandal, Eliza Thorne knew, with a deep and peaceful certainty, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. De Winter had changed the ton, perhaps only a little, but it had changed her completely. And sometimes, the smallest, quietest change in a single heart is the most powerful story of all.